everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Source with your hosts, me, Ilkka Turunen.
And hi, I'm Brian Fox.
And today's fantastic topic, Brian, is going to be about the compliance and regulation maze and what you need to know in order to survive it. Brian, though, I love your hat.
Yeah, so last week was all day DevOps, and they made special hats, and I was told I had to wear it, so I figured I'd wear it here today, because all the sessions are still online, on demand, so you can sign up and go watch them. It's like 24 hours of live broadcast stuff across like 6 channels. Like I don't want to do the math on that, but there's a lot of really interesting sessions. So go to alldaydevops.com. You can sign up and you can watch all of them on demand.
And I actually did the maths for you. It's 180 individual talks across all of those tracks. So it's some of the best. And I think you and I both also gave talks. You can safely skip those, but absolutely do look at the back catalog. They're really, really good. But hey, so today's theme on our episode is as governments and regulatory bodies worldwide continue to tighten their focus on software security, compliance has become more and more complex than ever before. So in today's episode, what we really wanted to do was do a little bit of a flyby on some of the regulation that's been passed, that's about to pass across the world, and what does that mean in terms of compliance. And finally, obviously, we'll talk a little bit about what we've seen organizations do to actually survive this sort of tsunami of regulation. So why don't we start off by talking about my favorite part of the world, which is where I live, Europe, and talk a little bit about some of the regulation that's been passed over here. Before we sit there, though, regulation in the EU is like super complex. There are acts, there are directives, there are other sort of elements over there. So why do we start there? Why do we define sort of what each of these mean, and then let's do a little bit of a drive-by on some of the ones that have been recently passed.
Yeah, so I'm not from Europe, so I'll try to explain it, and you can correct me or confirm. But I was confused about this. So there's two main things that have been going on in Europe in this space. There's the Cyber Resiliency Act, and then there is a related product liability directive. And I was a little bit confused on that. I didn't really pay much attention to the fact that one's an act, one's a directive. But it was recently explained to me that an act is basically a direct set of legislation that basically applies to the entire European Union. You know, it is effectively a passed law. And a directive, however, is more like a set of principles that then the member countries, the member states, have to pass their own legislation or update their own legislation to comply with, you know, the spirit of what the directive is. And so I think that's important because one of them would be sort of very uniform across the union. The other one might have country by country nuances. And also it takes time. Once a directive is passed, there's a timeline for which then the country legislatures have to do their thing. So it takes even longer to roll it out. Is that a fair description?
I think that's a really, really good description. I think my high school social matters teacher would be very proud of that explanation. So basically, unlike the States, the European Union is sort of an alliance of all of its member states. And what they basically said is, hey, we'll meet up in Brussels and in Strasbourg and in a bunch of other places. And essentially, we'll delegate some of the legislative ways. So an act essentially is sort of a very similar thing as a federal law over in the States. It just automatically, when an act is passed, it applies exactly as written across all the member states. There's sort of no room for interpretation. Versus a directive is really more of a every single member state should pass a law that fulfills these criteria and checks these boxes. You know, every country can kind of tweak the act a little bit or the directive a little bit. They can add their own things. Some countries have more strict regulation than others in certain elements, but roughly roughly they need to comply with the demands. And if they don't, they actually get a very stern letter from the European Commission saying you're not in compliance and you should go and fix that. So I guess an analogy from a US perspective would be state law versus federal law. State law might apply locally, might be tighter than federal requirements, but federal law applies uniformly no matter what. I think that's how
we don't have the exact equivalent of like all the states must pass the law, except in certain cases where the federal government might say, the one that comes to mind is the old speed limit law, and they would say like, if you didn't have a speed limit that was capped at a certain amount, we're not going to give you as much money for your roads or something like that. So it was not a requirement. It was choose your own, but we're not paying you if you don't do what we ask. That's the closest I can think of.
That's a very American interpretation. I think that's where we kind of differ. We're all like, what, control, you shall do it, or otherwise there will be stern telling off, which nobody wants. So you mentioned two things there. You mentioned the Cyber Resilience Act, and you mentioned the Product Liability Directive, and these are pretty huge and momentous pieces of regulation, no matter what, no matter sort of the flavor of it, because each of them have just been cleared by the Commission. I believe that they're just expecting Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Council, to sign on the dotted line, and then it'll get published into essentially the European Journal of Regulation, which makes it, set in stone, and that sort of starts an implementation starting gun for about 36 months or so. So the CRA especially, I think, is pretty monumental because it really changes the minimum security requirements for software and a lot of other things. So why don't you give us a quick overview of kind of what's embedded in there, because there's quite a lot of history in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite a long time actually since I read the meat of it. Most of where my focus last year was on trying to ensure that the CRA didn't inadvertently penalize open source or worse, cause open source to basically withdraw from the European Union market, which was a pretty significant outcome last year that could have happened. We managed to change that, and its open source is now excluded more or less from the CRA. But the requirements basically lay down things like, honestly, sensible best practices is the things you and I talk about all the time, that not shipping with known vulnerabilities that are not mitigated, having bills of materials, there's a whole litany of things in there. But I think the bottom line is that failure to comply can come with pretty significant penalties based on your worldwide revenue, up to, I believe, 15 million euros for failing to comply. So it's a pretty hefty stick they're going to hit you with there, potentially, if you're not doing these sensible things.
It's in fact 50 million euros or 3% of your global annual turnover, whichever is higher. So
it's the higher. Right. So
it's an even sharper stick.
Yeah, right. And so I think that's pretty significant in terms of getting organizations to face the music and do some of the right things. And there's been a lot written, a lot of thought into the CRA. And so this one, as a directive, once it gets published into the journal, as you said, 21 days later, it starts to come into effect. The actual penalties phase in over 2 to 3 years. But that clock basically starts, let's say, a couple months from now, once it gets signed and gets published. I think the Product Liability Directive, however, might be a sleeper changer, and it may have a much more profound impact, in my opinion.
1,000%. Yeah.
So, you've heard me talk a lot about, my frustration with the industry not really doing the right thing for the right reasons and kind of, checking the box, if you will. And then when they screw up and all of our data gets leaked, the downside is they buy us credit monitoring. At least that's what happens in the US,
That's pretty much exactly what that's exactly what happens here as well. have a 1-year annual subscription to this paid for service that you will automatically get rolled into a subscription to.
Right. And you've got 10 of them because 10 companies have leaked your data all over the place. It's a ridiculous situation where the cost of failure is not high enough for organizations to invest appropriately. Right. So that's my opinion. I've spoken and written on this for a while. And I think it's actually happening now in Europe. Right. So the product liability directive is not actually new. There is an existing EU-wide PLD from many years ago, but the important part is it carved out digital goods. So software, other things that were digital in nature were not included in that PLD. What the change this year is basically removes that exemption and provides a little bit more clarity. And so basically it means software that causes harm, that loses data, destroys things, now those organizations can be sued, like any other product failure. And so I think that will change the economics quite a bit. For companies will now have to focus not only on checking the box and being compliant like the CRA requires them to do, but now they will ultimately be on the hook for the final outcome. So even if you do all those things and you still bring a product into market that causes harm or leaks data or does whatever, you might be susceptible to lawsuits. Now, where it gets a little bit more complicated is because the European Union only can control what's going on inside their borders, there's this whole concept of importing software and distribution, and these things make sense in the physical goods world, but it's a little bit harder to get your head around in terms of the software. Who, in fact, is the importer and distributor may be unclear. And so I think that's going to be where some of the nuance is. The PLD also pretty clearly excludes the makers of open source, but not when somebody includes open source in a product and then sells it or distributes it. They are on the hook for that, as I believe they should be, right? So if you're choosing to use a thing for free, great, but you're still producing a product, you bear the responsibility of that. And I think ultimately that's where it's going to change some of the behaviors for the better.
Yeah, I think it's a very big mental change because up to this point, the way that the software industry and liability has worked is we all sign an end user license agreement. There's big indemnity clauses there that basically say, you agree to basically waive all of our rights. Just like this famous Disney Plus case, like, hey, somebody signed on a Disney Plus EULA, so they can't sue Disney, the corporation, for any of its aspects. Allegedly. So
yes.
Yeah, like the liability, it's like that. It's a contract, right?
People are wondering what you're talking about. Somebody, I believe his wife got injured or maybe killed at a Disney park, and they were trying to claim because they signed up for Disney Plus, the video streaming
like
service,
2 years ago.
2 years prior during some trial, that they basically waived all indemnification against the company for all things. I've lost track of where that is, but it's certainly an aggressive interpretation of that law.
And it's sort of a good example of how it actually works in software when you think about it, right? We sign these EULAs, and that EULA basically always, without exception, says, hey, by the way, you get the software as is. It's up to you to maintain it. No guarantees, and you can't sue us for any losses because it's up to you. So really what each of these laws to me kind of mean is, first of all, just, find any piece of electronics. Like I've got this wireless charging pad here that's sat at my desk. You'll actually usually find like a little stencil, like a CE stencil on each and every one of them. And that's like in here, if you can kind of see it on my video here. That's really what they're applying to software now. Every piece of software made available in the European Union market, regardless of where it was manufactured, you build it in the States, you put it in Europe, you're going to need this. You build it in Europe, you're still going to need this. It needs to attain, per version of software, a CE mark. That's in and of itself already a pretty interesting thing, that you have to sort of self-certify every single one of your releases to be compliant with those security best practices that, we kind of think are pretty much aligned with industry best practice anyway. But if you haven't been thinking about it, now you actually genuinely do. And what the product liability directive does is, if somebody then takes your software even if they misuse it and it causes data loss, like let's say, I don't know, they like feed all the fields really stupid stuff and they like manage to crash the server and whatever. If that leads to data loss and you didn't certify your software up to that standard, that means that you can be sued for, I think it's limitless, uncapped liability, essentially in a court of law. Like even if they misused the product and used it wrong, but you manufactured it wrong, you're liable. And that applies in any other good. Like, of course, if I crash a car by speeding and it turns out the car was mismanufactured, I'm going to take the manufacturer to court. That's like a no-brainer. But extending that line of thinking now into software is what's happening with these regulations. And that, I think, is going to be the big sort of hitter that's going to really start making this sort of regulation sinking in. I think we've had sort of industry best practice and self-regulation for quite a many years, and some companies do it really well, some do it less so well. But to have something this deep, like essentially it's all the regulators, especially in Europe, but also in the States, you guys have passed some fairly similar laws. And Jen Easterly from CSIS made some very similar liability sounds as well in public engagements.
Yeah, but we're only just talking about it and only very limited circles about it. So I'm particularly interested to see how this rolls out in Europe. Of course, it's going to take several years. I think it's going to take 2 years, or at least up to 2 years, for the member states to pass their own version of the laws. Who knows how long those things will take to phase in if they apply instantly, if there's backwards compatibility or anything like that happens. Will remain to be seen. The other interesting part is it doesn't stop there. We were chatting before the recording. There is also the draft AI liability directive. That one is still very early. I think they were waiting to see how the PLD and some of the other things unfolded, whether they even need it. For reasons I don't completely have my head around, apparently they feel like they need additional liability directives on AI, which is a little perplexing to me because AI is software and it's a product. And so therefore it seems like it would be covered by default with the new change, but I'm sure there's some nuances there. The current draft, I'm told, does not have an exclusion for anything open source. So we're kind of back to the starting point, but I think the community feels pretty good that those exceptions will be made because it needs to be aligned with the PLD and the CRA. It wouldn't make sense for it to be more punitive around open source. But as with all things, the battle continues. There's more coming, more to figure out.
And that's not all.
The bottom line for companies is, if you've been in denial that nothing's going to happen, especially if you're in the U.S. and you feel like, Congress isn't going to change the liability laws and the contract laws to preclude you from disclaiming liability in the EULA, you might be right. And also it probably doesn't matter because Europe is kind of leading the way on the liability side. And basically every company is a global company these days. And that means you're going to have to pay attention and follow these regulations. So, I think it's sort of a matter of how quickly can you turn your own organization around to be in a place where you feel like you are covered from both a CRA and a PLD, versus how long is it going to take to phase in. Many large organizations, it may take them longer than 2 years to clean up their mess. And so that means you're already behind the scenes, you're behind the time. Yes, you've got 2 years before the hammer comes down, but if you're not ready by then, good luck to you. So I think that's the kind of takeaway. You better get started now if you're not ready.
1,000%. I mean, it's like GDPR, to be honest. I think it's going to follow a very similar path. I think a lot of organizations will forget about it for a while, and then it'll come back with a bang. And when the first big fines are coming out, that's really when the big sort of drive for change is going to start happening. And I wish, we're actually starting to run out of time for this episode, but that's not even all of the regulation that's come out recently. Like in 2 days' time at the point of this recording, we're going to see something called the Network and Infrastructure Directive pass in the EU. And what that already does is take some of those requirements from the CRA and applies it vertically to some sort of more societally critical industries. things like transport, energy, banking, financial markets, postal and careers, but also digital service providers, online marketplaces, search engines, social networking, cloud computing,
It feels like all the
CDNs.
things.
Basically, all of the things. I mean, I could be reading this list forever and ever, but basically, there's also something called the Digital Operational Resilience Act, or DORA, which is another directive that's been passed to encompass the financials. Basically, what all of these are saying is there's now a minimum level of cybersecurity that's expected of you as a service provider, as a software manufacturer, as a product developer. And if you fail to demonstrate that you've done those things, you have those steps, as well as the policies, as well as demonstrate that when you built the software at the time that you did all of those things, the regulators are going to come after you. I think that's the big sort of takeaway. So if you haven't been thinking about having some minimum level of understanding, I think now is high time. Otherwise, it's going to be way, way, way too late.
Yep, I think that's exactly right.
Right. Well, one of the things that you can actually do if you want to see what you should do is we've actually published a lovely little regulations hub because there's so many of these, and each of them have these sort of super big requirements. So we've published these sort of very handy checklists actually that you can take a look. Kind of goes through each of the regulations, kind of tells you a little bit about what you need to do. And on the flip side, we also have a pretty picture that kind of shows you what you need to be doing across the SDLC. So we'll put that on the show notes. Go take a look. There's a lot of things to be understanding there. But Brian, any closing thoughts to part on this? I mean, it sounds like a big tsunami of change coming our way.
Yep. It's time to get out of the denial phase and into acceptance phase and start getting your organization ready. I mean, it's just as simple as that.
I couldn't have said it better than that. And I still am jealous because they actually ran out of my size on that cap. So I'm still waiting for mine.
So this would make you happy if I showed you I had another one here, would it?
Oh, man. Well, on that bombshell, we'll see you next time.
All right. Bye, everyone.